Chris is senior lecturer in archaeology at UCL at the Institute in Archaeology, and has been since 2012, when he's not pushing equipment around a field. Which seems to, given the amount of work that you've turned out, Chris, I think that's most of the time, isn't it? Chris, you're muted. Can you?
It feels like it sometimes, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, without further ado, people are still coming in, but we do need to get on. A quick run through for people who are new. If you want to put a question to Chris, and I'm sure many of you will, please use the chat function. Those will be relayed to me, and I'll put them to Chris right at the end. All questions welcome. And without further ado, I think we'll make a start. Oh, yes, one last thing. Please make sure that you keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off, because we are recording this. All right. So if you want to share your screen, Chris, and over to you. Yep, there it is.
Okay. Right. Can you see my mouse as well if I point to things?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to come and give this lecture tonight. For works purposes, I keep a spreadsheet of how often I talk about this particular project, and you have the dubious honor of being the 99th time I've talked about the surveys that we've done, not just at Verulamium and elsewhere. But I have tweaked this to have more about the roads than I usually do, which means I've had to chop a few other bits out of it. So I dropped the section I had on temples, but we'll see how we go. So what I'm going to do tonight is, first of all, I'm going to introduce the geophysical survey techniques that we use quite quickly, essentially trying to boil down into 10 or 15 minutes while I spend a whole module at the Institute teaching, and then show you some of our results. But the background of the project goes back to a grant scheme, which was just a one-off, announced in very late 2012. We had to submit the grant applications in early December 2012. We then heard whether or not we'd got the money in January 2013 and had to start the projects on the 1st of February. So it was a very quick turnaround. But the grant scheme was for what they called a jointly authored research project. In other words, a project where academics at a university came together with people from what they called community heritage groups, and I call archaeological societies, to put together some sort of jointly authored project. Now, I had a slight cheating advantage, because being the director of the Welling Archaeological Society as well as an academic, what I had to do was collaborate with myself, which was quite nice. But I did bring on lots of other groups, as you can see in this list. Sadly, 3 of those groups no longer exist, and one of the gaps in Hertfordshire is that we now no longer have a young archaeologists club within the county. So we got the grant, and that allowed us to buy a magnetometer with the aim of surveying Iron Age and Roman sites in Hertfordshire, and particularly to do a survey of at least part of Verulamium. Now, the range of techniques that we now employ has extended far beyond magnetometry. I've managed to put in a series of grant applications through work to buy new machines, and also has extended far beyond the borders of Hertfordshire, as you can see from this distribution map. And I've actually left off 2 surveys, one in Lancashire and one in Durham, that we did last year. In fact, I think I did about 12 or 15 surveys last year, which was a little bit more than I should have bitten off, really, but there we go. So we have extended greatly from the original grant scheme. But the original grant scheme was for 1 year, and we've now been going for 12 years. So I think they've got their money's worth from us. Verulamium, as I'm sure most of you know, is a Roman city in the southern part of the province, marked by the red arrow on this slide. And it's quite important because the largest city in Britannia is London, followed by Cirencester, followed by Verulamium. So as measured by the town walls, and you'll see why I make that little distinction later in this talk, as measured by the town walls, it's the third biggest Roman town in Britain. But if we look at the public towns, and I emphasize the public towns, that don't have a modern city built on top of them, it's one of only 5 public towns that don't have a modern city built on top of them. But before we started, it was the only one that hadn't had some major geophysics project run on it. So it had this combination of being both the largest, one of the largest towns in Britain, and certainly the largest town that doesn't have a modern town built directly on top of it, but it hadn't been surveyed, which is why we started wanting to survey at this site. So here's an aerial photograph. One of my volunteers just happened to be flying over the town in a light aircraft, took a picture for me. And the town is split into 2 halves. So the southern part of the town, to the bottom of the photograph, Verulamium Park, is a public park. It was sold by the Earls of Verulam to the city back in the 1930s. Basically, the Earls had gone bankrupt back in the 1930s and needed to sell some land. And that now is, you can visit the park, and the red line marks the approximate line of the town wall. But that is only half the Roman town. The other half of the Roman town is still part of the Earl of Verulam's Gorhambury estate, which you can see on the upper part of this slide. And in many ways, the results from the Gorhambury estate have been even more spectacular than those from Verulamium Park, simply because we don't have lots of goalposts and pipes for watering cricket pitches and footpaths and all the rest of it running through the Gorhambury estate. Now, obviously, we've known about Verulamium for a very long time. There have been a lot of excavations over the years on various parts of Verulamium, but the 2 big excavation projects were those run by Mortimer and Tessa Wheeler in the early 1930s, and then those run by Shepherd Frere in the mid-50s to very early 1960s. Mortimer and Tessa Wheeler were invited by the Borough Council. They actually fed them a slap-up meal in the town hall and gave them lots of wine to come and investigate the town when they had bought the land from the Earl of Verulam. And then Shepherd Frere's excavations were as a result of the plan to upgrade the road that ran through the middle of the town from a small country lane to the main road from St Albans to Hemel Hempstead. This wonderful photograph, I remember this model when I first visited the museum in Verulamium when I was 10. This is what the museum looked like back then. And they used to have this wonderful 3D model in the middle of the museum at that point. And you can see how little we knew about the town at that time. In fact, the model slightly underestimates what we knew because it's mainly the result of Wheeler's excavations rather than Frere's. So it was a big town. We knew something about the street grid, largely from aerial photographs, but much of the town was blank. We didn't know very much about what was in it. So here's a plan by Rosalind Niblett. The green line shows the 3rd century town wall. The purple line, this thing running along here, is called the 1955 ditch. And the 1955 ditch has that name because it was first sectioned in 1955. Nothing to do with it being made in 1955. And it's in fact the late 1st century boundary of the town. Frere dated it to round about AD 80. and at least the southern part of it seems to have gone out of use round about AD 125. Then we've got an area on the southern part of the town down here, which was dug by the Wheelers, including quite famous buildings like the Triangular Temple, and there's a Mancio. Most of this area was actually excavated by Tessa Wheeler, while Mortimer was off digging sections through the defences and off at Wheathampstead and various other places. And then we have a series of excavations along the line of Blue House Hill, which were dug by Shepherd Frere in the 1950s. And then a few other structures were dug by other people. So the theatre was originally excavated by Richard Grove Lowe in the 1840s, but then the state you see it now was a result of Kathleen Kenyon's excavations in 1933. And the Insular 16 temple was dug by Lowther also in 1953. Many of the other buildings we only know about from aerial photographs. So the techniques that we use, we started off doing magnetometry. And in fact, this isn't our original magnetometer that we bought with the grant, because we literally wore that one out. We now have a new magnetometer built by a company called Census, and this is it. And magnetometry is really good at detecting things we're not interested in, things that are made of iron, horseshoes, water pipes, barbed wire fences, things like that. But it's also good at picking up burnt things like hearths and pottery kilns, and it can also detect organic material. And this is because organic soil, topsoil, your compost heap, is actually slightly more magnetic than subsoil. So where you have a ditch or pit or something like that, which is filled up with more organic topsoil, we can often detect that. So it's good for ditches and pits and kilns. And I've added a 4 here in that it's not usually all that good at picking up roads, unless you're out in the outside the town where you've got roadside ditches. And if those roadside ditches are full of slightly more organic material than the subsoil it's cut through, the magnetometer may well pick up the boundary ditches. So in order to do a magnetometry survey, our new machine has 5 sensors, 5 probes. And the reason for that is it makes it much quicker if we can collect 5 lines of data at a time, rather than how it used to be done originally, which is collecting 1 line of data at a time. Each of those probes actually has 2 magnetic sensors in it. And the reason for that is that we are standing on a very large magnet called the planet Earth. And if we don't somehow compensate for the Earth's magnetic field, which is not stable, it does vary, the archaeology in our signal gets swamped by what's happening with the planet's magnetic field. So what we actually do is take 2 readings, one at the bottom of this tube and one at the top of this tube, and we subtract the top one from the bottom one, which is essentially taking out the planet and leaving the archaeology. And this is why it's known as magnetic gradiometry, because what we're looking at is the magnetic gradient between the top sensor and the bottom sensor. Now that all happens automatically. There's nothing, you don't have to do anything about it. That's just built into the system. But that's what's happening. And this is why magnetometers are nearly always a long tube. And then our newest system, we have the luxury of having a differential GPS attached to it. Now that means that you're all used to using GPSs on your phone to get to the pub or whatever. But the GPS on your phone is only accurate, as I'm sure many of you know, to 5 meters at best. The differential GPS talks via the internet to a series of fixed base stations, and that enables it to correct that signal to be accurate to about the width of my little finger, 9 millimeters or thereabouts. Now, this has the advantage when we're surveying of not having to lay out grid squares. We don't have to work in grid squares anymore. We can just go backwards and forwards between markers. We have people holding a target. You walk towards the target, and then there's a piece of string in the foreground marked every 2.5 meters. and the people holding the top, you can see the string in this, move along, and that's it. You go backwards and forwards. And the idea is that you're trying to basically, like painting a wall, cover the whole of the surface with your paint roller. In this case, cover the whole of your surface with the magnetometer. But it doesn't matter particularly whether you're going east or west or north or south, as long as you cover everything and you don't want to overlap too much, which is be a waste of time. So this is a typical magnetometry survey, particularly good one, I should say, at Ashwell End in the north of the county. So with magnetism, we have a positive and a negative end of the magnetic pole, if you like, north and south. So where you have strong black, which is positive in all my images, and strong white, which is negative, we have something which is ferrous. So this black and white dotted line, which runs across the plot, and the one at right angles to it, those are old, probably disused these days, iron water pipes. Mid-grey, however, is background, is nothing, is not very interesting. So in here, there's very little to see. What we have in this plot is this bit that looks like somebody's thrown a plate of spaghetti at the screen. Each of these lines that are mainly black with a little bit of white either side, those represent ditches. And then we actually have little blobby bits down here, and there's many others as well, which are pits. And we know from the surface and from the site generally that this is an Iron Age village that obviously has many phases. Up on this part of the site, we've got a series of square enclosures with a linear gap between them. And this, we know again from surface finds, is a Roman village. And presumably this is a trackway running through the middle of the village, coming down this way. We then have these curvy lines in the background, which I'm sure many of you will recognize are ridge and furrow. And we have narrow rig and we have broad rig, and then we've got modern field boundaries. So in this one magnetometry survey, we have Iron Age, we have Roman, we have 2 phases of medieval cultivation, and then we have modern features like the pipeline. What about roads? Well, we did do a site near Bygrave. We were asked by Herts County Council to do a transect across this field, and we picked up a Roman road. And you can see that in between the 2 ditches, very little shows, but the 2 boundary ditches that run either side show very clearly. And in fact, the crop marks show this feature running right the way across this field. So the road shows quite nicely, in this case, out in the countryside. Earth resistance survey, the second method we use, we're passing electric current through the soil. And the way we do that is we have a battery in the machine here. We pass a current down, and then there's a probe which we stick into the ground. The current then runs through the soil into another probe, comes up, back along the wire, back into the machine, and we get a circuit. Unfortunately, with a single circuit, factors like contact resistance between the probe and the ground, you can't get an accurate reading if you put the voltmeter in serial with the circuit. So what you do is you set up a second circuit, which actually does the measurement. So you have one pair of probes setting up the current through the soil, and the second pair of probes taking the readings. The sharp-eyed of you would have noticed that there is a 5th probe in this image, and that's simply because this is a very slow method. So we have a multiplex, which is just a switching box in the machine. So when you stick it in the ground, it takes one reading and then a second reading. And then as you move it, it takes, whoops, gone too far, one reading and a second reading. Move it, one reading and a second reading. So it just enables you to take 2 readings side by side. Now, the reason this is interesting is because in order to pass electric current through the soil, you need salt and you need water. Mostly what we're measuring in Britain, at least, is water. And so if you have something solid, like a road, it will be high resistance because there isn't much water, so it won't pass an electric current very easily. Whereas if you have something like a ditch or pit, that may pull the water in that ditch, and the electric current will flow more easily. Again, we have strings and tapes, and it's just a matter of going up and down the strings. We take our particular group take readings every half meter in both directions. So a 20 by 20 meter grid square, we get 40 by 40 readings in a 20 by 20 meter grid square, which gives us a reasonable data density, a reasonable image. And this is an earth resistance survey we did at the Roman small town of Dura Brevi. And we can see this square low resistance feature with a high resistance edge to it, and then another square in the middle. I'm sure most of you will recognize that as a fairly caricature, typical Romano-Celtic temple. Why is it low resistance in the middle? Well, I think what's happened here is that we have a square foundation that's continuous. And so as it fills up with water, the water's not draining away very easily. It's acting a bit like an underground sump, entirely unintentionally. And that's giving us the low resistance. And then we can see some roads and some boundary ditches and so on around the edges of it. Now, usually, earth resistance survey is not very good at picking up ditches and pits, but it will do sometimes. So if we go back to Bygrave, we did a small amount of earth resistance survey along the Roman road. We did pick up the two boundary ditches quite nicely, but also we picked up the fact that within those boundary ditches, we have a higher resistance area, which is probably the surviving remains of the road surface. Then the last technique we use is ground penetrating radar. So in this funny looking cart system, there's a radar antenna. It fires a radar pulse into the ground. And then when it bounces off of something, if it hits something solid, a change of material in the ground, some of that radar signal will bounce back, and a second antenna will record both the strength of that reflection and the time it takes. So as you push it along and it hits a thing and it hits a thing and it hits a thing, obviously you can see that this line is much shorter than that line. And when we plot the results, we end up not with a nice little point, but with a hyperbolic curve. Now, in some ways, that's a little bit of a pain, but it's also vital because we can match in software that curve. And that by matching in the software that curve, we can calculate how fast the radar wave is traveling, which enables us to calculate the depth that the features that we're finding are at. Now, radar, unlike the other methods, in its raw form, gives you a vertical slice through the archaeology, like looking at a section instead of a plan. So this is what the radargram looks like, and no archaeologist ever wants to look at these, but this is where all the information is. So the strong white and black are strong reflections. And here we've got a strong reflection, and it goes doing, like an echo, goes down. Some of the radar wave is bouncing back. Some of the radar wave is going deeper. Then we get to another change of material where, again, we get a series of echoes, another doing, and some of the radar wave is going back and some of it's carrying on down. And what we actually have here is the top of a Roman wall and the bottom of the Roman wall. So as it goes from stone from the Roman wall into the subsoil, we're getting another echo, which shows us both the top and the bottom of that feature. Now, here, the echo is being caused by something right at the ground surface. And one of the things that causes an echo is water. So if you have some sort of vegetation that holds water, like a mushroom ring, you'll get an echo. And I can actually, if you would like a plan of 30 hectares of mushroom rings, I could give you a plan of 30 hectares of mushroom rings. Because no archaeologist wants to look at those horrible vertical plans, vertical slices, even though they are absolutely vital thing to look at. but I promise you that's the last one I'll show you in today's talk. So what we do in the software is stack them side by side and then slice them in the other direction so we can turn those vertical sections into a horizontal plan. But not just a horizontal plan, we can produce a series of plans at different depths. So here is us surveying. Again, it's tapes and strings. You start and stop on the tape. We use 40-meter grid squares, and you're going up and down every half a meter. So as a result, this is much slower than doing the magnetometry survey because we're walking 5 times the distance to cover the same area. And then this is some of these time slices, some of these plans. Now I've just inverted the colors in this. There's no reason why strong reflection should be black and weak reflection should be white. And in this case, it was slightly clearer flipping the plan, so I did. And here in the top left-hand corner, we've got the first slice, and you can still see the bottom of the plough ruts. Even though it's over 20 years since they last ploughed this field, we can still see the bottom of the plough scars, and we can see the tops of Roman wall foundations coming up. Then, as you go a little bit deeper, the wall foundations become much clearer, and then very clear at this depth. And as we go down, and then you'll notice at this depth, this building is starting to become less distinct. And by the time we get to here, this building's completely disappeared. So this small building off to one side clearly has much shallower foundations than this building, which seems to have really quite good, quite solid foundations. Just once at Verulamium, this chap, Mike Langton, who is the sales rep for the company that makes these machines, turned up with this fancy box. And this fancy box has 8 antennae in it at 8-centimeter intervals. Again, it has a GPS on the top, and you tow it behind the quad bike, which means you can cover very large areas. But it also means that the radar waves hit everything in the ground, not just a selection every half meter or every meter, how often you want to push the thing up and down. This thing will hit absolutely everything in the ground. So you get a very clear image, and you'll see some of those slightly later on. Now, people have been doing geophysics at Verulamium for a very long time, and the first surveys were in 1959 and 1960 by Martin Aitken, who had taken a German paper that theorized that magnetometry would be useful for archaeology, built a magnetometer, and then started doing some surveys with it. And it did actually prove to be extremely useful. So here's one of those surveys. This is the northern corner of the 1955 ditch. This is Aitken's plan from 1960. This is our plan from 2017. And you can see, though this is one reading every 5 feet, and this is one reading every 10 centimeters, that there's a gap in the ditch, there's a gap in the ditch, there's a strongly magnetic bit, there's a strongly magnetic bit, there's a gap, there's a gap. It does actually match really surprisingly well between the two surveys. But what we do get is a lot more detail, like there is this very thin ditch-like feature behind, which I suspect might be something to do with the earthen bank that would have been on the inside of this. There's other pits and things show up much more better with the greater data density. And this just compares the different techniques. So this is the earth resistance survey, and you can see this building showing very nicely. This is the magnetometry, and unusually, very unusually, the building shows quite well in the magnetometry here. This is the ground penetrating radar. And then if you can't afford fancy toys, just look very carefully on Google Earth, and you can see it as a parch mark in the grass on Google Earth. So just to throw an extra one in, if you wanted to survey roads, which technique would you use? So MAG might find the ditches. It won't find the road surface. Earth resistance is slow, but if there's surviving road surface, is very likely to find it, and it may find the ditches. Similarly with GPR. Now, there's a technique I haven't mentioned yet, electromagnetic induction. And the reason for that is We just got a new one of that. Well, I've never used one before. The meter turned up just before Christmas, and I haven't even taken it out of its box yet. So that's a watch its space till I've had a chance to try it. So what would the ideal would be to do what we're able to do at Verulamium, which I know is a huge, huge luxury, which is to do all three. If time is the essence, do mag. It's easily the fastest technique. But I think usually I would say do mag plus one of the others. So either do mag and earth resistance or mag and GPR, depending what you have. Because the mag tends to find the ditches and earth resistance and GPR tends to find the solid things. Okay, let's go back to Verulamium. So over the time we've been surveying there from, we haven't done any work the last couple of years, although as you'll see later on, we're going back. But we did the park originally, and then we extended into Gorhambury, and then we extended outside the town and have been doing various bits and pieces around the town. And so we've now done over a square kilometre of magnetometry at Verulamium. In terms of GPR, when we started, I didn't know we were borrowing a machine and I didn't know how long we'd have it. So we were jumping around a lot to survey particular buildings that I wanted to plan on. And then as it became obvious that we would have access to this machine for a bit longer, we became a little bit more systematic. We did miss one block, which we had to go back and do. Then 2020, of course, we didn't do anything. And then 2021 and 2022, we did black rounds. So we've done the whole of the Gorhambury estate within the walls, 35 hectares of GPR. That's about 40 gigabytes of data. And my volunteers walked 700 kilometers pushing the machine. We have done some work in the park as well, as you will see, but that's a few sample areas rather than a complete survey as we have done at Gorhambury. And then earth resistance, which is the slowest of the methods, made even slower because we usually work in August, and we've had at least 2 summers where we haven't even been able to get the probes in the ground, let alone take any readings. But we've done about 13 hectares of earth resistance survey, which as earth resistance surveys go is a pretty big survey. So why do all three? Well, here's the earth resistance survey of just one bit of the Gorhambury. And you can see, I hope, where I've drawn the red circles, 2 buildings. This one, we have a corridor and a line of buildings. There's actually another wing of buildings coming here in the typical layout for Verulamium. And then over here, we've got a much smaller building with what looks like an apsidal end and possibly a side room off to one side. There are other buildings, obviously, in here. This is the Roman road running through here. Now, if we look at the magnetometry survey for exactly the same area, here we can see the building. We can see as white, lack of magnetism, if you like, the walls of this building. But over here, that building does not show in the magnetic data at all. Now, I have some fairly good ideas as to why that is so, but that's why you tend to do mag and either res or GPR. They show different things. They give you different bits of information. So all of these pits that are full of some sort of magnetic material won't necessarily show on the res survey or the GPR survey very well, but they do show beautifully well in the magnetic data. Now, you'll notice this mess up here, this very strong white and black area, and that looks like something that's burnt down. Now, if we go back to the earth resistance survey, there's the end of a building here, but there's maybe a little bit of surviving floor or something here, maybe a little bit of a cellar here, but really no great sign of surviving walls in this area. Now, we know from excavations that Verulamium burnt down in the middle of the Antonine period, around about AD 155. And I suspect that this area was a timber building. Most of the town was built of timber up until that date, which burnt down during the Antonine fire and was never replaced. So what we're seeing in the magnetic data is the signature of a strong fire that's never then been subsequently disturbed. So some highlights. And I've stuck roads in first, given the group we're talking to, and then we'll have a look at some of these other things as well. As I say, I've had to cut some things out to keep it all to a sane amount of time. So this is the street grid at Verulamium, as plotted by Rosalind Niblett from aerial photographs. I'm not entirely convinced by this little green diagonal connecting bit, but Watling Street does a very odd sort of, it cuts into the town at an odd angle and then does a series of zigzags to get through the town and back out the other side. You'll notice that Watling Street doesn't seem to line up with the entrances to the Forum Basilica complex. That is merely a Victorian surveying error. If you correct for the Victorian surveying error, these entrances do actually line up with Watling Street. So if we start in the southern part of the town, unfortunately, Watling Street outside the town lies underneath the golf course, which we haven't been able to survey. And given how much landscaping happens with the golf course, I'm not entirely certain that it would be a very profitable occupation, although it might be worth doing it at some point. So Watling Street just really shows as a blank, as a not very much. There is a part of the street grid running off here with the blue arrow, and then this triangle represents the position of the triangular temple of Verulamium. Now you'll notice in the magnetometry survey that nothing really shows the triangular temple. And if you think what happened, Wheeler completely excavated the temple. Originally, he was hoping to put it under a building like the Mosaic building at Verulamium, but wasn't able to do it, so he then backfilled it. So what we have is a complete jumble of backfill, which just shows as a noisy area in the mag data, not as a nice clean triangular building. Now, if we zoom in on this southern bit of the town, sorry, let's just go going the wrong way again. The London Gate, the bit that you can go and visit, the Wheeler excavated, is just here. Now, if we go and look at the town, so we've got the mag data. This is the ground penetrating radar data. And here's Watling Street. Oh, excellent, excellent. There's Watling Street. And then all of a sudden, there's a great big hole in it. And one of the recurring features, as you'll see over the next few slides, of the roads at Verulamium is that they've been robbed. And I think what's happened here is because Watling Street survives as a slight bank in the park, that they've dug down, they've found the road, and then they've followed it along in order to excavate out the building material, which then gets recycled up in the medieval town. We do have one of the side roads showing quite nicely, although I don't know whether this bit has been robbed or whether it's just slightly deeper and it's not the radar signal's not quite getting down to it. I'd have to look at the radargrams. You have to look at those vertical slices to work that sort of thing out. But here's Watling Street coming on through. Now, this is the radar survey done by that Toad array. This was the result of a day and a quarter of survey. So not very much time at all, but it was an enormous area we managed to cover in huge detail. And we can pick out the various roads. This one, which is Watling Street again, we can see running across the tennis courts as a crop mark. So that's worked very well for picking up the roads. We're going to look at this little bit up here, which was where we started surveying when we were teaching the course back in 2013. And this little bit, we did the magnetometry survey. Larry Conyers did a ground penetrating radar survey. A couple of the other tutors did an earth resistance survey. And this is what's on the St Albans Urban Archaeological Database. We can see the road running through quite nicely. We can see a building in here quite nicely. This is this building. Interestingly, we can see this building on this side of the road, but in the mag data, literally the other side of the road, that building is not showing. And it has to be to do with soils, and I suspect it's to do with soils and how things were cleared or not cleared after the Antonine fire. But the interesting thing with the road is if you look in the earth resistance data, there's the road, beautifully, and then it ends. Can't really see where it ends in the magnetic data, but this is the ground penetrating radar survey. And again, you can see it just ends. And in fact, if you look on Google Earth, there it is, and it just ends. And it ends because it's been robbed. It's been robbed for flint building material for the medieval town. Now, through the middle of the town, we have very little survey data because there's the museum and the car park and the church and the school and various other things. So we have to skip to the other side. So here's Blue House Hill running along the bottom. And this is the ground penetrating radar survey. And this is the line of Watling Street. Whoops, going the wrong way. Running across. One thing which is quite interesting is that the later drive to Gorhambury starts off being directly on top of Watling Street, but then deviates away and then swings back to join it again at the other end of the town. This follows the line of the medieval road into Gorhambury, and it actually is quite closely aligned with the change in geology from chalk to gravel. Whereas the Roman road didn't care and just went straight over the gravels. It wasn't bothered about differentiating between the subsoil at that point. Now, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a kink just about here. And that kink occurs where the northern triumphal arch is situated. And the northern triumphal arch lay on the line of that 1955 ditch, that earlier boundary ditch that I was talking about, and marked the edge of the town. So it wasn't a gateway in the sense that that it was in any way defensive, but it marked the boundary of the town because the boundaries of towns were extremely important. And at that point, the road changes direction just very slightly to head back until it hits the Chester Gate in the woodland here. Notice how so much of the road, we just have a little bit either side surviving, and that the bulk of the material in the middle of the road has been robbed. This is the plan of the Triumphal Arch. It was excavated, as you can see, in 1961 by Frere, and it was then and is now a very substantial, solid piece of concreted masonry. It's just visible as a lump in the field now, but it's still a very noticeable lump in the field. One thing I did want to point out is here's the radar, there's the Triumphal Arch, is that if we compare the radar plot with the earth resistance plot, in the earth resistance plot we get a much better image of where this side road is. And I have generally found that within Verulamium at least, the streets seem to show better in the earth resistance data than they do in the GPR data. When you know where they are, you can say, oh yes, look, well, yeah, you know, there's something there. But it's much clearer, more obvious in the earth resistance data. And that, I think, is to do with the way that we process the data, because we're taking slices through the data with the radar, whereas the earth resistance data is actually a block sample. And if you want to know where all that building material went, at least some of it ended up in St Albans Abbey. The tower is largely built of Roman brick. I suspect that these little columns might be recycled as well. And then the body of the abbey is also largely built of flint. But then a lot of the other buildings in the town have flint foundations or are totally flint and so on. So here's our MAG survey. Let's get away from the roads of the whole town. And the most obvious thing is the 1955 ditch, this early boundary of the town. So post-Boudica, but late 1st century. Now, it's quite deep. This is Shepherd's Friar's section across the 1955 ditch. We're not entirely 100% sure where Friar's sections were. One of them was about here, one of them was about there. That's because if you look in the report, it says, 250 feet from the corner of the hedgerow. So it's not 100% sure where those excavation trenches are, but it's a big, deep feature. Now, if we zoom in on the southern part of the town, this is the MAG survey. Here we've got the 1955 ditch running like this. Here's a water pipe, which was watering the cricket square, which is here, partly leveled by some modern dump to give a nice flat square. There's some buildings, some fainter than others, showing. This thing that looks like Mickey Mouse's ears is a pottery kiln. Now, if we overlay some radar data, we can't really see the ditch in the radar data, but what we can see is a faint hint of what I think are probably a foundation layer for the earthen rampart at the back of the ditch. There's this building which has been built over the line of the 1955 ditch, and then some more buildings and the beginnings of a bit of road. The other thing which is a bit puzzling about the MAG survey is what this ditch is. Now, if we zoom out and look at the town as a whole, there's the 1955 ditch, there's that ditch. We have the southern bit of the town, which is really, really busy, pottery kilns, roads, built houses, various other things. And then we have a big area of nothing, really, very quiet, almost nothing showing in any of the surveys. With this boundary ditch, this ditch separating the two areas. And I suspect that what we're looking at here is the town deciding to incorporate this southern area of the town into the town by extending the boundary at some point in the 2nd century. Why would they want to do that? Because if you're inside the town, they can tax you. If you're outside the town, it's harder to tax you. So I suspect that this is an extension to the town boundary, intermediate between the 1955 ditch and the later 3rd century town wall. And I also suspect, looking at our other survey data, that the story of the 1955 ditch is much more complicated than dug in AD 80, went out of use in AD 125. I think different bits of it have slightly different stories, which is not surprising when you see how long a feature it is. So the next feature I want to look at is another long linear feature. So here's our 1955 ditch, but then we have this feature, which doesn't seem to follow the town grid. There's wiggles across the landscape. And when we first found it, we nicknamed it the sinuous ditch. And then we were trying to work out what it might be. And then there it is. We noticed that if you look at the 19th century Ordnance Survey map of Verulamium, which happens to plot the 300-foot contour, that the 300-foot contour looks very similar to the shape of this ditch feature, even down to there being a bit of a wiggle, although the wiggle's going the other way, but down here. So why would you dig a ditch that followed the contours? Well, the only reason you would dig a ditch to follow the contours in this sort of way is if it was the town aqueduct. We've known that Verulamium had an aqueduct for a very long time because aerial photographs like this one, we can see it running through the fields to the north of Verulamium up towards Redbourne. On Google Earth, you can see it running through some of these fields. So we've known there was an aqueduct, but we had no idea where it went or where it ended once it entered the town. So we now know where the aqueduct goes in the town. The interesting thing about the aqueduct is that it ends just before it gets to the theatre. Now, one of the things about Verulamium is people don't really realize that Verulamium is built on quite a slope. And so this area is actually a good 15 or 20 feet higher than this area. We have the road, which has been robbed in places. We have a building where instead of dark lines like this building, we have light lines. And that must be where we have robbed walls. And then we have some square areas of high reflectance, which are probably surviving floor features. This is relatively near the surface. If we go down a bit deeper, we start seeing slightly more of the walls, and the road shows slightly better. And then if we go a bit deeper, we actually find that we have preserved things like this apsidal feature, and possibly a long, thin room or a corridor and some other rooms. Given that the aqueduct is upslope, and we have this probably quite substantial building just a little bit downslope, and we know from 19th century excavations that there are drains running across the lower field, I wonder whether this area represents where the town bathhouse was sited. There have been various suggestions as to where the town bathhouse is, but at the moment my money is on this particular bit of the town. If we look, again, another bit of Gormby, sorry, this is slightly messy. There's a lot of data and it's been processed using two different software packages. And I'm in the process of slowly going back through all of the data, reprocessing it to try and come up with a prettier image, but it shows what I need it to show. And first of all, we have the street. Rosalind Niblett and Isabel Thompson numbered all the streets. So we have this insula with a nice big building in the middle and some buildings around the outside and so on. If we look what we knew before, for the same area, what we knew before we did the geophysics, this is that insula here. So we knew a little bit about a building from a crop mark, a little bit about this building from a crop mark, and then this feature, I think might be plotted in the wrong place, is in theory from the Historic England Geophysical Survey from 2000, but it doesn't match anything that I've found in that area. So the nice thing about this is what we have in this insula is some nice big townhouses. This is the posh upper end of houses at Verulamium. We then have a whole series of smaller buildings that seem to have more ephemeral buildings in the backyards, corridors from the road to the back, and so on. So I think these are probably more like shops and more modest houses. And then over here, we've got a very odd structure with what looks like a series of fairly solid columns of some sort. If I was in the north, I would say, oh, we've got a granary. We do get things we call granaries in the south, but not really of that sort of form that I know of. If anybody knows of a granary with nice solid pillars like that in the south, please let me know. But that's what it looks like at first glance, that we may have a granary. I think they're too big and too far apart to be the pili of a hypocaust. And then if we go over to the other side, this is in the park. This very strong white and black line is an 18-inch gas main. This line of very strong white and black marks are the old lawn tennis court that when they decommissioned it, they just cut the railings off at ground level and left the spikes in the ground. Paths, water things, but we can see very faintly in here the the Mancio, nice townhouses over here and so on. So here's our streets, and then if we look at Niblett and Thompson, we can see the Mancio, which was dug by the Wheelers, a few buildings that were known from crop marks. This little bit corner here was dug by Rosalind Niblett in the 1980s. And then if we go back and look at what we get from the multi-channel GPR, you can see we've got quite a lot of detail, but if we zoom in a bit more, now that's as far as I go, you can see how much detail we've got for individual rooms, surviving floors. Here's the road, buildings facing onto the road, probably a alleyway running into the backyard area. And this very faint sort of line running across is that 18-inch gas main that completely ruins the magnetic data in that area. So a beautiful set of data from the towed GPR array. Now, if we go back to black grounds, the red line here marks the 1955 ditch. There's that triumphal arch that I was talking about. And through 2021 and 2022, this particular field threw up a whole series of unexpected surprises. So to the north west of the 1955 ditch, so outside of the original town boundary, but inside the later town boundary, this is Watling Street, we have the sorts of buildings we expect: nice posh townhouses, strip houses, that sort of thing. Nothing particularly surprising. Once we get into the town, the earlier town, we then have what looks like an open courtyard with not very substantial buildings and probably not very well preserved buildings around the outside. South of Watling Street, there's a few sort of unusual shaped buildings, but we seem to have a courtyard. Looks a bit like a marketplace or a forum, but we know where the main forum was. Maybe it was a subsidiary marketplace. The real surprise, however, was this building. And what we have is one wing of the building with a whole series of rooms and surviving floors with a corridor at the back and a colonnade at the front overlooking the River Ver. We have this building, which we think is a detached bathhouse. Then behind that wing, there is an open courtyard that has earlier phased buildings beneath it. There's then this very strange, long, thin building with sort of two rooms at either end and a central room, then another open courtyard with a building tucked into the corner, and then Watling Street. And these two blobs, I think, are the entranceway. To give you some sense of scale, there's the building turned slightly at an angle, and here is St Albans Abbey at the same scale. So this wing of this building is essentially the same size as the nave of St Albans Abbey. It's huge, it's over 80 metres long. And because the public road is off to the left, Watling Street is off to the left, we have an open area, another open area, and then this, and it's looking out over the river. I think what we have is a private building, which I'm for the moment calling the Palace. It makes very good publicity to talk about the Palace at Verulamium. And it's clearly overlooking the river, so it must predate the town wall, which was built just along here, because why would you build a big colonnade to look at the back of an earth rampart and a stone wall? So I think this was probably built sometime in the 2nd century. There are other big private buildings known around the Western provinces and in Britain. So there's this villa site at Eccles, which is actually bigger than this building. It's 100 metres across. But all the big buildings that I know in Britain are in the countryside. I don't know of a plan of a big building like this that we have from inside a town. Now, of course, that's partly because places like London, we have hints of big giant buildings, but because it's London and we've got lots of nice excavated bits, but they are, you know, it's like having a jigsaw puzzle with 90% of the pieces missing. We haven't been able to reconstruct a single big building in this sort of way. One of the things I found quite interesting looking at the Eccles report is a number of these big palatial buildings across the Western provinces. Nearly all of them had some sort of water feature at the front. And I think in the case of our building, the water feature at the front is the river, that it's placed there on the bank above the river. There's quite a steep drop down to the river just beyond where the colonnade would be, looking down into across the river to the fields or whatever was on the other side of the river. Next to the palace is another courtyard building, which clearly has multiple phases. So I think this is the next slide. Yes. So we've got this aisle building, which seems to be one of the later ones. And then in the middle of the courtyard, we've got one of the earlier buildings is this quite strongly buttressed building in here. I don't know what it is. And then if we move slightly further down, we have an even more peculiar building. This is the Theatre Road running across here with a little bit of a bend, go out the gate here. And we have a courtyard with a series of small buildings on the inside of this courtyard. Again, I don't know what this building is. And this is the thing which has been both fascinating and frustrating, is up until the 2021-22 survey seasons, we found lots of really interesting things. But most of the things, oh, that's a big townhouse, that's a small house, that's a pottery kiln, that's the road, that's the aqueduct. There weren't too many mysteries. The interesting bit about this second half of Blackgrounds is it's a series of buildings that we don't understand. We don't, from their plan alone, know what they are. We'd done the magnetometry in advance several years before we did the GPR. And we can see here, there's that odd, long, thin building. But the palace part of the building doesn't show hardly at all. That, you know, there's some strongly magnetic things in there, but it doesn't really show the walls or where they are. And I wonder whether what we're dealing with is we have the Roman wall running along the very edge of our survey area that's all been robbed. But behind the wall originally was a clay bank. And I wonder whether what we've got is that the clay bank that's eroded back down in this direction has actually meant that the features are just slightly too deep for the magnetometer to detect in this area. What I do want to point out, though, is here is the Bathhouse Road, Theatre Road, with a little bit of a bend, goes through the town here, and then the magnetometry is showing a series of square features. And this, if we look at the LiDAR, is a very distinct causeway with these little sort of wings coming down the sides. And I think what we've got here is a very deliberate attempt to strengthen this meander in the river so it won't erode away, to build a causeway, probably with timber boxes, essentially, giant timber framework, to take the road, the Theatre Road, down from its height by the wall, down to the river, and there must have been a timber building across the river and then into the field on the other side. Very clear, sort of solid causeway showing in the LiDAR data beautifully with these reinforcing bits around it to stop the meander eroding away by the river. So when we look at the town, we've got lots of empty area. When they built the town wall, much bigger than they needed it to be and in a very silly place. In places, it's overlooked by the surrounding landscape. It doesn't make any sense as a defensive structure. And if we look at the gateway as originally built, very grand, very nice, but very big gates. It's not a really very defensible structure. And we know that in the late Roman period, they built bastions on forts and town walls to help defend them. And in Verulamium, we have some bastions, two of them, 200 meters apart, and not in the right place for them to really be effective militarily, and certainly not big enough to be effective militarily. So I think that what we have here is a building which is a town wall, which is largely symbolic. If we go to Périgueux in France, here we have what a real bastion looks like. Now it's got medieval, the top half of this is medieval, but the bottom bit is good surviving Roman work. Very close together, very substantial and quite functional. Now, if we look at the plan of Périgueux at its height in the early 2nd century, we've got the amphitheatre, we've got the famous circular temple, very nice house museum. It's worth going to visit. You know, a fairly typical sort of Roman town. And then in the 4th century, they build this castle-like defensive wall, big bastions and relatively small. And to give you a sense of how small it is, if you in Photoshop overlay the town wall with the earlier town, you can see that all they've done is essentially create a little citadel in the middle of the original Roman town. That we're not dealing with a defensive wall that's intended to defend the town as it was. We are dealing with a defensive structure, a real defensive structure. That's not what happens in Roman Britain. Roman Britain, our 3rd century walls are much more like the 1st century walls on the continent, which were built for show. And I think that the wall at Verulamium has more to do with the ego of the population of Verulamium than it has to do anything to do with actual real defensive structure. It's too big, it's in the wrong place, it doesn't have the right sorts of bastions, its gates are too big. This isn't a new idea. This idea has been kicking around for at least 60 years, at least 50 years. This is a very young Richard Rees. Richard must be 85 now, I think. And he originally was promoting this sort of idea quite some time ago. So this isn't something that is new to me. But the geophysics is backing up that idea that there's a lot of the town was empty. So where do we go from here? Well, the most immediate thing is here we have the Earth resistance survey that we've done in background, overlain on the GPR. I really want to publish the palace, and I'm glad to say that Lord Verulam has said that at Easter we can go back and extend the Earth resistance survey over the palace. So in a couple of months' time, we'll be back at Verulamium doing the Earth resistance survey over this structure, so that when I publish it, I can have the GPR survey and the MAG survey and the Earth resistance survey. And if I have enough volunteers and enough time, I have my new toy. This isn't mine. This is my friend Jared's, but it's the same machine. This electromagnetic induction meter. I'll get it right. EM survey. And I want to at least try that over the palace as well to see whether that gives us any extra bits of information. And then just to wind up, I'd like to remind everybody that I have the privilege of sitting here or going to various places and talking about this project and waving my arms around, being very excited about the archaeology. But all of this work is done by my volunteers. And without my volunteers, none of this would ever have happened. And they're a brilliant bunch. And I just want to thank them all for all the work that they've done, making this survey work and the other 69 or however many sites we worked on possible. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. See, you did have time to put in those bits you cut out. Would have been fine. You've heard well, at least one of my talks. You know, I've got overrunning to an absolute professional standard. So
yeah.
No, that was absolutely brilliant. It really was. And no surprise, we've got quite a lot of questions coming in already. So good grief. I'm going to get straight on with these. I will read through them, but I've got a suspicion that actually some of them, one or two at least, you did answer during the talk. That often happens. People write things down and then deal with it. But,
yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Right. So this is a very good question. What makes organic material magnetic?
Aha. So iron minerals come in various forms. Magmite, magnetite, hematite, and they're all slightly different levels of magnetism. And as soil is formed and water levels go up and down, they change from one form to another. and they usually, in the process of soil formation, change from a slightly less magnetic form to a slightly more magnetic form. So it's part to do with what soil scientists call soil fermentation. It's also because the magnetobacteria that break down your compost heap to turn it into compost have a little magnetic particle in them. So when they die, they leave the little magnetic particle behind as well. So various processes to do with soil formation end up with topsoil being more magnetic than subsoil.
Mm.
It does depend on what subsoil you have. And in some areas of the country, the topsoil and the subsoil are very similar, and mag survey doesn't work very well. In other areas of the country, you get quite a strong difference, and it works pretty well. And then that's enhanced by the fact that human beings are largely slobs and chuck their rubbish and their burnt fires and their leftover dinner, whatever it was, into the nearest pit, ditch, or whatever. So sometimes you'll see when you're surveying a settlement, you'll see the ditches very clearly inside the settlement, but as you move away from the settlement, they become fainter and harder to detect.
Yes, we actually see that a lot. I know some people call it the habitation effect, don't they? It's we see it a lot with surveys that we do. When they're near a settlement, we'll see the road coming out exactly where we expected it to be, and it just gradually disappears. Very common.
I'm going to jump ahead of you for a second. I didn't mention the fact that we have a blog that has a lot of our results on it. And so that's the web address for the project's blog. There are over 100,000 words and about 1,500 images on that blog now.
I've looked at it many times.
Yes,
for those who didn't see, Chris has just put that address onto the chat, so it's there for everybody.
The smaller sites tend to get one blog post and read more like a mini report. Unfortunately, Verulamium is, because it's so big, it's more of a diary format. So it tends to be a bit harder to get a sense of what's happening with Verulamium. There is a publication in the journal Archaeological Prospection for the earlier part of the survey. And if anybody wants a copy of that, if they drop me an email, I can send them a digital off print of our article. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Right.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. On a related question, this is from Susan Rands. If magnetometry is able to pick up the presence of organic material, does it have potential for detecting concentrations of animals, for example, in holding pens or small pastures?
Yeah, you would expect an area that had a lot of animals in, that it would be more magnetic than the surrounding fields. The downside is the way that magnetometry works is that you're always zeroing to the local background. But there is a related technique called magnetic susceptibility survey, which would pick up those sorts of things. So if what you're interested in is trying to detect within a settlement where they may have been keeping animals, then you do a magnetic susceptibility survey instead, or as well, in fact. And that you usually do that as a very broad scale survey, so one reading every 5 meters or something like that. But if what you're after is that sort of broad scale pattern, then that's the way you would approach that problem.
I think specifically Susan will be interested in horses.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Now there's 2 questions here relating to the wobbly nature of Watling Street at the eastern end of the city. So from Dave, that's our Dave, as Watling Street doglegs through the city, does that mean the street grid came before the road layout, or could there be an earlier straight through or a bypass around the outside? I think you touched on this at least.
Yeah, this has been a matter for discussion for at least 100 years, I think, because we think the street grid is laid down post Boudica. But obviously, Watling Street, as its original military way, is probably pre-Boudica. So why it does such a weird zigzag when it gets in the town in order to fit the street grid, or whether originally it went straight through the town and then they decided to not have too many silly little bits and make it do the dog legs, has been a matter of discussion for a while. We think it still originally went through the town because there is this thing called the central enclosure, which we don't know very much about because it's very deeply buried, but it's approximately under the church and the museum, which is the sort of Iron Age centre within the town. So most of the Iron Age stuff is up on the hill or outside the town, but there is this thing called the central enclosure. Quite why they built the museum on top of it, I don't know, but they did. And Watling Street is going to the central enclosure. So
that's interesting. Yeah. It's always worth pointing out as well that there was often quite a big time lag between the planning of a road and its actual construction.
Yeah.
And we've got examples all over the country where we know that's the case. Certainly Deer Street, the John Poulter's postulated it could be as much as 30 years that lag in some cases. So it may even be possible that part of Watling Street had been fully built and the eastern bit may not have actually been constructed when the grid was laid out. We'll probably be speculating for another 100 years, Chris.
Probably, yes.
Although David Breer does point out when they built the wall around it, Watling Street did go straight out through the gate.
Yes.
Right. Question about the new induction machine. What are you hoping to pick up with that? That's also from Dave Armstrong.
Okay, so the electromagnetic induction with a magnetometer, it's a passive measurement. It's measuring the magnetic field as it is. The EM meter is actually creating a magnetic field. And you get two measurements. You get what's called apparent magnetic susceptibility, as well as conductivity, which is the inverse of resistance. Because the machine has 3 receiving coils and 1 transmitting coil, you actually get that information from 3 different depths. So unlike magnetometry, where everything is lumped together, the EM meter will actually give you the magnetic values at 3 different depths. It all tends to, everything in geophysics depends on the soils. So on some sites, you will use one of these machines and it just looks like a horrible mess. You go away and smile sweetly. Other sites, you get very nice results. And they found, for example, on road schemes in Ireland, because of the soils, they were getting better results with an EM meter than they were with magnetometry. Now, of the techniques that are available, it's not one that's ever been particularly popular in Britain until recently, because the hardware that was available wasn't very stable. And it's only with the more recent generation of machines that people have started using it in Britain. It was always more popular in the US than it was in Britain. So that's why it's been the last of the techniques that I purchased. And it's very much a when nothing else works, we'll give this a try machine, rather than where I'd always start with any survey, start with mag.
Yeah. I'm curious as to what depth it might. You said there were 3 different depths it registered.
I think it goes down to 1.6 meters.
Really? So you've got more depth than you usually get with mag as well, then?
Yeah. Well, with mag, it all depends on how magnetic the thing is you're measuring.
Yes.
So if you have, as we have had on one site, a buried car, you'll pick that quite a long way down.
I think we've all had a buried car, Chris, or a tractor. I said the last one was Dave Armstrong. Actually, it was probably from Jeff, because I don't know who signed in on our account. One of our staff, anyway, has also asked, what software are you using?
Oh, so I use Terra Surveyor for the mag and res, and I use a package called GPR Slice for the ground penetrating radar data. On the GIS stuff, I use QGIS.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. From somebody who remains nameless. Oh, being right on Watling Street. Oh no, it scrolled over to the side. That's why. Actually, it's from Susan. Could that large courtyard complex be a mutatio?
Yes,
It's very large.
it is very large. Yeah. And there is this other building that we think is the Mancio. Would you have a Mancio and a mutatio in both in the town? Don't know.
I
But
suppose,
yeah,
you know, given that we don't really understand that much about Mancios, if you
no,
think of Mancio as a hotel, you've got to keep the horses somewhere.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um,
But yeah, no, it's certainly a possibility. That courtyard just inside the 1955 ditch, the results there are not very clear. And I don't know whether that's because the buildings were relatively ephemeral or whether they're just not very well preserved at that point. You have to remember that that side of Verulamium was ploughed right up until 2000.
mhm,
Whereas the public park side of Verulamium stopped being ploughed in the 1930s,
right.
which is why you can still see the medieval ridge and furrow in the public park, but that's completely gone
Yeah.
in the estate side.
John Barry's made a comment, a very simple one. Shops? Question mark.
Yeah, well, I think as I showed in that insula, I think some of the smaller buildings are shops. I didn't because I'm worried about time. There's certainly some buildings on Watling Street as you get close to the Chester Gate that look like classic strip buildings with shops at the front. But one of the things about Verulamium is that from the excavated evidence, it appears that the town's nature changed a bit after the Antonine fire. So most of the things have been excavated, which is not a lot since Frere. There are fewer smaller shop-like buildings post-Antonine fire than there are pre-Antonine fire. And most of what we're finding in the geophysics, I think, are post-Antonine fire stone buildings.
Right. Okay.
Um,
There's still plenty of questions coming, don't worry. And one specifically about the equipment from Alison Spencer. Alison borrows our cart from time to
yeah.
time. She wanted to know, and I didn't spot this, what are the two red stroke rust coloured struts on the cart, magnetometer cart?
Red rust-coloured struts.
Oh, I didn't see it either.
Um, where's my picture icon? Um, the only thing that I can see, which is red, which isn't really a strut, it's just little marks. And so I don't know whether this is what you're asking or not. But what we did when we got that cart, because I wanted to be, if there was an error, I wanted to be sure which sensor or which cable was playing up. We color coded the sensors and the cables so that we always have the same sensor in the same slot and the same cable attaching that sensor to the box. So one of the sensors, if we get process some results one day and one of the sensors is playing up, we know which one it is.
Yeah, we do exactly the same thing for the same reason.
Yeah. There are some, I don't think I showed one today, but there are some photographs of our cart that have two long poles with red lines at the top. And those are just our target poles. but they happen to fit in the spare slots in the frame. So when we're walking from the car to where we're surveying, we just stick them in the slots in the frame. When we're actually surveying, they come out, and that's what we're aiming towards. But literally, the target poles are literally 2 meter lengths of plumbing pipe from B&Q.
We've got broom handles, but anyway, it works.
Yeah, it's the same basic idea. Yeah.
From Tom Brearley, a question: is there any prospect of digging the palace?
Everybody asks that question. The problem with digging the palace is, I would need to get a big grant to do even a small amount of excavation, because the amount of material culture we're likely to retrieve is going to be enormous. But I also would have to get permission from Lord Verulam to dig up his farmland, and permission from Historic England because it's a scheduled ancient monument. It won't surprise you that every so often I fantasize about being able to put some trenches across the palace. But I must admit, up until now, I've rather shied away from the complexities of getting a grant, getting permission from Lord Verulam, getting permission from Historic England, and all
Historic
the
England's the big one.
other.
Getting permission for that I wouldn't have thought is likely, but
Yeah.
although it does seem things do seem to be improving in that, so they're not quite as absolute no every time now. But,
yeah.
From John or John's, are there any publications we can find about this work?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, there's the article in Archaeological Prospection, and if you email me, I can send you an off print of that. There are also articles in one of the issues of British Archaeology late last year, and Current Archaeology about 5 or 6 years ago. And again, I can send you those. And then there's the blog, which has a lot of material on it. In terms of publication plan, eventually the idea is that there will be a typical Roman society doorstep research report, which will have all of it in.
Can you put your email address on the chat, Chris, if you don't mind doing it?
No, that's
anybody
fine.
can contact you who's interested.
And then more immediately, once I've done the earth resistance survey over the palace, we have a couple of papers that we want to publish on the palace. I want to do one more generally about the palace, obviously based on the geophysics, because that's all we have. But one of my undergraduates, now a graduate, did a stunning piece of work for her dissertation where she was able to phase the building from the radar survey.
Wow.
And so she's going to be submitting that to Archaeological Prospection. Okay. Yeah.
I look forward to seeing that. From Hilary Brindley, would the wheeled traffic in Watling Street have flowed through the Triumphal Arch, or can you detect a deflection around it?
No, it definitely goes through the Triumphal Arches. Yeah, well,
right.
Monumental arches, I think is a better way of describing them. There were at least 3 of them. There was one near the southern entrance, near the Triangular Temple, which Wheeler excavated. There was one next to the theatre in the middle of the town, and you can still see one of the bases. If you go and visit the Roman theatre at Verulamium, one of the bases is still visible there. And then the third one that we know of was that one I showed you the excavation plan of from 1961 up near the northern end of the town.
And Paul Wood was wondering, I'm assuming he's referring to Watling Street, whether it might have been a toll road. I'm not sure why he's thinking that, but
I have no idea. I don't think we have any evidence of Roman roads being toll roads, do we?
I'm not aware of any There are records of people being charged for the use of roads, and
Yeah,
that practice being stopped. I'm talking about the late Empire now,
yeah.
4th and 5th centuries. So there's record of that, but not in Britain, as far as I'm aware.
Of course, what happens at Verulamium is that the medieval monks deliberately blocked Watling Street to force the traffic to go up through the medieval town, where, of course, they could then be charged for going into the medieval town and coming back the other side. So that's why the road system changed, is they actually deliberately blocked Watling Street. So you had to go up into the town and then back down Fishpool Street and join Watling Street at the far side to go carry on northwards out of Gorhambury. Yeah.
Still got a lot to go. I hope you don't want to go to bed early. From Gerard. Would the geophysics help you locate the town cemeteries and their extent? And do you have any plans to do that?
Cemeteries are really difficult for geophysics. So if you have cremation burials, obviously an individual cremation is quite small, really. So you might pick it up with one of the magnetic sensors, but would you know it was a cremation rather than a tractor bolt or something? So in order to pick up individual cremations, you really need to bring the sensors closer together, have a 25 centimeter transit spacing rather than a 50, which then doubles how long it takes to do the survey and so on. And the problem with inhumations is that you dig a hole, quite a deep hole, you put the dead person in the bottom of it, and then you put exactly the same soil that you've just taken out of the hole back in the hole again. So in terms of geophysics, the soil in the hole is almost identical to the soil outside the hole. So I've done GPR surveys and so on in churchyards, which I know are stuffed full of graves and not detected a single one. They're really hard to find.
Yeah.
The one exception to that at Verulamium is there is a field just over the river where on Google Earth are lots of funny looking square features. And we're suspicious that these might be little mausolea within a large cemetery. And certainly Rosalind Niblett thinks that's a large cemetery in that field. And that's one of the many fields in and around Verulamium that I'm trying to get permission to survey.
I've been trying to keep up with what you've done over the years, but I don't recall having seen much sign of mausolea along Watling Street, surprisingly.
Yeah, no. Well, we've done where Watling Street comes out of the town, we've done the field known as Church Meadow, and there's almost no sign of anything in Church Meadow. Now, whether it goes off at a slight angle through the field next to it, and we're in the wrong field, which is why we want to. Well, I want to survey the field next to it anyway, because that's where the aqueduct goes, and I'd like to start tracking the aqueduct outside the town. But yes, no, the one field we've done outside the town with the GPR, almost, and there must be burials there, absolutely must be burials there, but nothing much shows in the geophysics. It doesn't help that damn, excuse my language, gas main runs through the same field, which makes life
yes. There's always a flipping pipe where it gets interesting.
Yeah, but this is an 18-inch cast iron gas main, so it's a 30-meter wide swathe across the field. That is,
when we did the Roman fort at Rowcliffe near Aldborough, there's a 3-foot storm drain goes straight across the bottom of the plot, and it just wipes everything out for 10 meters either side. Paul Wood has clarified he wasn't really meaning a toll road. He was wondering if parts of the town were being restricted from access. I think that's basically it. I just saw the chat.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Parts of the town off limits to some.
Well, possibly, I suppose, because although the wall itself would not have been defensive in a here comes an army, we need to defend this town sort of way, it would stop sort of small bands of random robbers and things like that by shutting the town gates. But we also know that they charge tolls for merchants and things going through towns, and that's why the town boundary was so important. And that's why I think they moved the town boundary further south to include the pottery kilns and the structures associated with all the rest of it, that you've got a body of population living just outside the walls. And it was worth extending the boundary to bring that little suburb inside the town.
Makes sense. Yeah. David Breer comments, incidentally, the museum, which you mentioned was on top of that Iron Age enclosure, is great. And I agree. You're absolutely
right. It was visiting that museum as a 10-year-old that got me into archaeology originally. So.
And they still have drawers that you can pull out to look at more finds than are displayed.
Yeah.
I've forgotten that, but yes, it's a while since I've been.
The funny thing is I think of that as the new display, but the new display is now 25 years old and they're trying to get money to have a new display, so
yeah, doesn't time go?
Yeah.
Gerard again. The buttressed building in the courtyard next to the palace reminded me of the granaries at Corbridge.
Yeah. Again, the same problem that now one day somebody's going to say, oh yes, but we dug one in London or Colchester or somewhere, but that sort of granary we see in the north at places like Corbridge, but I don't know of any granaries like that in the south.
No.
I wondered whether that buttress building, given that it's quite deep, may have been some sort of water cistern. If you've got water coming from the aqueduct down towards it, that it might be some sort of storage cistern or something. Because it is a good 1.5 meters down, that building. Yeah.
Well, there'd have to be some sort of reservoir somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's a big structure, so it's possible.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Somebody was asking about whether there was a Castellum Aquae.
That was Gerard again.
Yeah. Not that I've managed to detect in a way that you could put your finger on and say, oh, look, the aqueduct sort of ends. I think it ends because there's a bathhouse just down slope from where the aqueduct ends. And I suspect the main function of the aqueduct was to supply the bathhouse with water. But unless we get permission to dig some holes in it, that's always going to be a nice idea that we can't quite prove. Yeah.
Oh, we're back to the rust-coloured struts.
Right.
2 short vertical bits, about 2 feet in from each end, if I remember correctly. I don't know. Could there be bits of tape that look like struts? I don't know.
I don't know. What?
Hi. I remember the slide that they appeared on. It was fairly close to the beginning. It was the magnetometry array being, I think it was perhaps the first slide with the magnetometry array being shown. That's the one, and I think it's the.
Oh, right.
Got it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now I know. They're not struts.
Oh, these.
Yeah.
Okay. No,
it's the wings on the edge where you bolt it all together. We've got the same cart, so.
Right. Yeah. So with this particular machine, the middle 5 tubes are 1 bit, and then there are 2 wings which are attached to it with 2 nylon bolts. So that's the bit with the wheel on is 1 wing. I'm waving my mouse around on the wrong slide, but it doesn't matter. So it's the wings on either side. We also we were very lucky that we managed to purchase the towing kit for that cart, but we haven't yet had the chance to use it in anger. because we have to either hire or beg or borrow steal an ATV to tow the thing behind.
Mhm.
But we do
But
actually
if you
have
do get to use it, let us know how you get on, because we're
yeah,
thinking about doing the same.
yeah. Well, a friend of mine has one that he tows, and the biggest problem is that you get a very faint, what they call tank tracks in the data, which is where the sensors are slightly bouncing and tipping in and
Yes.
out the magnetic field. And it just depends on how pretty you like your mag plots being, whether they annoy you or whether you're
I'm going to
prepared to
move
live
on
with
to
it.
the next question, avoid answering that.
Yeah,
I've seen some truly awful towed results from towed arrays where people
yeah,
have gone far too fast and the whole
yeah,
flipping
yeah.
cart's bouncing up and down all
Bouncing
the time.
around. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, um, Catherine Thorne, could that huge building with the colonnade and the big open areas be one of those Roman sports centres, Palestria?
I don't think so. I think what we've got, and I didn't really explain this, I think what we've got, so in the Roman world, if you're a very important person, you have clients and you meet your clients in the morning, usually. So what I think we've got is a private building because it's turned its back on Watling Street. There's nothing fancy along the Watling Street facade apart from an entrance. And I think what we've got is an entrance with a public courtyard area. Then that long, thin building, I think, is where the patron meets his clients.
Mhm.
And then there's a slightly more private courtyard. And then there's the private palace building. So that's what I think the structure of that building is. I don't think it just doesn't have the feel of a public building. If it was a big sort of palestra or part of a bath complex or something, the fancy bits would face onto the street, not onto the river.
Mhm.
The whole thing sounds like somewhere where you go out on the terrace and drink your wine, watching the sunset over the Ver. Has that sort of feel about it.
I think it's a fairly, I'm sure I've seen that sort of arrangement somewhere before, and it's not that dissimilar to Fishbourne, although Fishbourne's a much smaller scale, but
Yeah.
it's not that dissimilar, I don't think. There were,
Yeah, Fishbourne has a much bigger sort of internal courtyard. The problem with our courtyards is that the fancy bit of the building looks out rather than looks in. See what I
Mm,
mean? Um, but yeah, but then when you look at all the plans of these big fancy buildings, they're all really quite different. They have
mm.
certain things which are common, like having a colonnade or having a water feature or whatever. But they're really quite varied. Yeah.
They're still coming. Two more. You don't escape yet. Oh yeah, this is actually a question to me, really. Will we get a link to this talk? I definitely want to watch it again. That's from Michelle. Yes, you will. We've had a lot of problems getting the videos online. It's not a technical problem. It's simply a lack of volunteer to do it. But we've solved this issue now. We think we've actually had 2 volunteers get in touch to solve that. So hopefully we'll get all the talks onto YouTube very soon, because we are way behind. So sorry about that, Michelle, but yes, it will be there. The links will be on our website once they're up and done. From Wesley Brown, what was the name again of the Roman settlement in France with the large bastions?
Oh, Perigueux.
Short and sweet, that's the shortest
Yeah.
answer. All right, nice easy one. Okay, I think.
I will say I only picked Perigueux because I'd been there on holiday and taken some photographs of it. I could have picked any number of other cities in Roman Gaul.
It did
Um,
that did raise a very important issue that you did go into about the actual function of walls. And I don't think it's really discussed enough, because there are certainly some sites which have enclosures within them, which are really hard to understand. Horncastle being an
yeah,
obvious one.
yeah,
For those who don't know, there is a walled structure inside the Roman town, but it's really small. What was its function? Was it there
yeah.
as a defensive unit just for the elite few? Nobody really knows. And there are other within small towns, particularly, you often get a defended section in the centre, the
Yeah,
defended core, which I'd be very surprised is just there for show.
yeah.
Uh,
No, those are more like the continental examples.
yes,
So even in
exactly.
Paris, the defended bit was the Ile de Paris,
Yeah.
not the broader city.
Mm.
So it's much more common on the continent. The British pattern of town walls, particularly on the public cities, is the anomaly. We are the odd ones out.
Mm. I actually had an email from a regular of ours, Jan Scott, which, sorry, I haven't replied, Jan. It wasn't, I'm not ignoring you. It's just I haven't had time to get round to it, but it's on
Yeah,
exactly this issue. She's the volunteers at Aldborough,
yeah,
North Yorkshire, and bits and pieces of the wall survive in one
yeah.
stretch. Not great, but it's there.
Mm.
So she gets asked all the time what the function was. So people tend to think she observes in the way of a medieval town wall,
Yeah,
which is not serving the same job at all.
yeah, yeah. I have found over the years that people find it very hard to accept that a town wall could be a vanity project rather than rather than something that was more functional. Um, whereas we know in Gaul in the Augustan period, you get towns that have big fancy gateways, nice big fancy wall, and as it goes round the corner, it stops. They never finished it. So as you come along the main road, there's a lovely gate, there's a lovely wall, but it doesn't actually enclose anything. Literally, it's just like, because at that stage, of course, you could only have a wall if you were a colony, and so that was a way of telling the world that you were an important colony.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I suspect the British examples have more in common with those, which
Mm.
says a lot about how um, uh, not dangerous Britain was in the 3rd century and 4th century. That there were a lot of civil wars happening on the continent.
Could it also be making some sort of a social statement
Yeah,
in a similar way to, I hope I'm not going to offend anybody here, but how
yeah,
gated communities in this country and in
yeah,
other countries, they're getting more and more common, but they are setting a certain group of people aside from the rest.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, I don't think the dates match, unfortunately, but it did strike me that we've got a Roman town with an enormous town wall and an enormous palace. um, and and of course the Folly Lane burial, where you've got a very rich burial outside the town in the Roman period, but Iron Age in form and rite. So there's quite strong hints of a continuity of an urban elite in Verulamium from the Iron Age through. Um, so yeah,
hmm, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but we shouldn't be
yeah,
surprised.
yeah,
There's more continuity than a lot of people like to give credit to, I think.
yeah, oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah, I think so.
and nobody has asked another question. So sorry, Chris. So I
Right.
think we'll goodness, it's 9:20. We'll
Yeah,
start to wind everything up. Um, so it just really remains to thank our audience tonight, and we've still got 96 with us. I want to apologise to all those who booked on Ticket Tailor and struggled to get in. The link on Ticket Tailor was telling people apparently that the lecture hadn't started, and it was blocking
oh,
people out. I had to
yeah,
field about 40 emails in the first 10 minutes.
right, yeah,
So I hope
that's a
everybody
pain.
managed to get in. We've not had this problem
Yeah,
before. There are loads of issues with Eventbrite, but never with Ticket Tailor. So I'm sorry
right,
about that,
yeah,
everyone.
okay,
Okay. So thank you all again. Thank you especially to those who made a donation to help support us and the costs of doing this sort of thing. Zoom doesn't come cheap. And thank you to the backroom staff. You saw Susan earlier on. We had Jeff and Dave as well tonight. So thanks, guys. And our next talk, I think, was on the splash screen before. And for the life of me, I can't remember who it is. But I will get the next one up and ready to book in the next couple of days. Let me just check, because I'm feeling very silly that I can't even remember who we've got next. Just bear with me. And for some reason, I'm not being able to get onto our website. Oh, here we go. Sounds low. Alan Montgomery. The Road to Mons Gropius, a journey through Roman Scotland. So that should be good. There are a couple of Scottish ones this year already. So that's next. That's on the 20th of February.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Mike, can I just ask you quickly how many we ended up with in the end?
Yeah, I think because of the problems with Ticket Tailor, it wasn't as many as I was hoping. I think it was 195.
Right, that's okay.
I think
it's just that I have to keep these records for work. They like to know these things. So.
Chris, 197 was the peak.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah,
I'm glad you were paying attention, Jeff.
Yeah, it's just useful to keep a record of how many come to things that I speak at. So, okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. The meeting's gone on quite a long while, so I think
it has. We'll let you disappear.
It was a really interesting set of questions, actually. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I was going to ask, but there were so many questions coming in. I didn't about the southern side, as you know. I've asked if you'd got any much work done in that area. Not a huge amount, I don't think, have you?
No. So we've done inside the town. We've done a bit outside the town, but as I was saying, Watling Street runs through the golf course. And although I have thought about trying to persuade the golf course to let us, because now we have the GPS controlled mag cart, we could actually survey up and down in the days we had to lay out grid squares, it'd have been a pain in the neck. But with the census, we could go up and down the fairways and things fairly quickly if we could find gaps when they were playing golf. But whether it would show us very much, I'm not sure.
I personally suspect. I mean, we're interested in finding the Silchester Road, which has long been a bit of a mystery.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it's just ploughed out, and we'll never see it.
Yeah,
could be wrong. It might still survive in places. It certainly does further southwest. We've pretty much pinned it down now, and it's not where most people think it is.
Yeah. What a surprise.
Anyway, that's for another lecture.
Yeah.
Right, I'll let you go. We normally do a very quick resume afterwards, but we're so late tonight, and I've got to go, so I think we'll probably skip that. So great to talk to you again, and we'll see you again soon, I hope. Okay. Good night, everybody. Those of you still with us, and I'll see you in a few weeks' time, all being well.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.